Treaty of Vereeniging has just been signed here in South Africa. The South African War has finally ended. But before we get to today's treaty, let's review the conflicts and wars between the Boers and the British that resulted in what we have today. First, there were problems with the Transvaal government. As stated, the Transvaal was a republic consisting of the Boers as well as some indigenous people. In the 1870s, the government was faced with some serious financial issues. A war between the Boers and the Petty cost lots of money for the government. To add on to this, the Boers didn't pay their taxes, so obviously, this resulted in major struggles for the government. Furthermore, the British annexation of the Transvaal definitely caused some problems. In 1877, Great Britain annexed the Transvaal into their colonial empire. This occurred after a series of petitions and border disputes between the Boers and the Zulus. At first, the English-speaking citizens were mostly in support of the British annexation. In fact, even some Boers were in favor of British annexation because the British claimed that they would protect the Boers from their neighbor rivals, the Zulus. But this annexation did not go without opposition. The Boer opposition to British rule in the Transvaal was the next step towards the First Boer War. At first, some of the Boers in the Transvaal didn't mind British rule because Great Britain promised to protect the Boers from their neighbor rivals, the Zulus. But in 1879, the Zulus were crushed by the British to the point where they weren't a threat anymore. So, the Boers declared their independence because they didn't need protection from the British. This resulted in the First Boer War, or the War of Independence. The First Boer War occurred between December of 1880 to March of 1881. In essence, the war only lasted a few months. The most important moment of the war was the Battle of Mahuba Hill, which was on February 27th in 1881. Shockingly, the Boers won. They beat the British. This battle ultimately ended the First Anglo-Boer War. The British signed a truce on March 6th and a peace a few weeks later. So that's the First Boer War. But then, of course, there was a second one. There are several factors that led up to the Second Boer War, or the South African War. The war itself began in 1899 and concluded today, in 1902. One of the factors that led to the war was the discovery of gold in Witwatersrand. This discovery ultimately increased tensions as both the Boers and the British were fighting for gold. This eventually resulted in a gold rush. Furthermore, the president of the South African Republic, Paul Kruger, built a railroad to Portuguese East Africa in order to reduce their long-term dependence on merchants at the Cape. But this move could not come without opposition. The British believed that this threatened their commercial interests. Moreover, there were a series of political issues. The main issue was whether or not the English speakers should have the right to vote. The Constitution of the South African Republic said that only males who have lived in the Republic for at least 7 years were allowed to vote. President Paul Kruger refused to expand these voting rights. Nationalism continued to emerge throughout the country. Nationalism truly began in the early 1880s after the victory at the Battle of Mahuba Hill. With all this, President Paul Kruger tried to reach a compromise with Britain. However, Great Britain simply ignored his attempts. In September of 1889, Joseph Chamberlain issued an ultimatum demanding that Kruger give the British the right to vote. Nothing happened, so Britain sent troops to South Africa, but did not officially declare war. In October of 1889, knowing that the British were about to declare war, Kruger took action and, allied with the Orange Free State, declared war on Great Britain. The South African War, or the Second Boer War, lasted from 1899 to today, in 1902. The goal of the British was to re-establish their dominance in South Africa. On the other hand, the goal of the Boers was to defend their freedom and their self-government. The war was harsh. It caused ample amounts of suffering, especially on the Boer side, as the British used a scorched earth policy. At first, the Boers picked up a few victories because they had a numbers advantage. But then, once the British realized that they were losing, an astounding 500,000 soldiers came over from Britain. Now 90,000 Afrikaners faced 500,000 British. 2 years ago, in 1900, the British took 3 significant cities. 1, the capital of the Orange Free State, 2, Pretoria, the capital of the Transvaal, and 3, Johannesburg. Additionally, in 1900, the British Army forced President Paul Kruger into exile. The British put almost all Boer women and children into concentration camps. Over 25,000 died. But, finally, the South African War came to an end today, May 21st, 1902. The peace was constructed by Alfred Milner, a High Commissioner in South Africa. The peace has 3 main principles. 1. It is intended so that Afrikaner power will be ended forever. 2. It also says that the Boers must hand over all weapons and agree that their territories are now part of the British Empire, as the Orange Free State Colony and the Transvaal. Finally, the British are to give 3 million British pounds to restore the destroyed Boer farms. With that, the Boer Wars are finally over, but there is still lots to be done in order to stabilize South Africa.